Well, good morning, everybody, and greetings from Crisis Group's New York office, where we are delighted to welcome you for some analysis of last week's UN General Assembly high-level session and a look ahead to some of the major challenges for the UN in the next 12 months. I'm Richard Gowan. I am Crisis Group's UN Director, and I'm really pleased to be joined by Gérard Araud, a former French ambassador to both the UN and the US, and now a member of Crisis Group's board and an old friend of the organization. Laurel Miller, our Asia Director, and Marithi Matiga, our Horn of Africa Project Director. What we're going to do today essentially falls into two parts. We're going to talk a little bit about the main lessons from this month's General Assembly session. And of course, last week was a bit of a homecoming for the UN, with the first in-person meeting of leaders at the General Assembly in 2 years. Those of you who have been in New York will know that suddenly First and Second Avenue were once again full of cars and sirens and politicians walking around looking very self-important. And it did feel as if the UN was back after a period of dormancy during the first wave of the pandemic. This was also notable as President Biden's first address to the UN since entering the White House. And Biden had to both address some major crises on the world agenda, including climate change and COVID, but also deal with some fairly big political challenges, the situation in Afghanistan and competition with China. And we'll be talking in a moment with Gérard about how the president did with this complex set of challenges. But having looked back, we also want to look forward, because at the end of the day, the UN is not judged on how well it organizes conferences in New York. It is judged on how it performs in trouble spots and conflicts around the world. No one, I think, can remember any speeches that the UN heard in 1994 or 1995, but I think everyone remembers that those were the years where the UN faced major disasters in Rwanda and Srebrenica. Right now, the UN faces some pretty enormous humanitarian and peacemaking challenges around the world. 2 weeks ago, we published Crisis Group's list of 10 challenges for the UN in 21-22. Those include the situations in Libya, the situation in Haiti and elsewhere, but we highlighted 2 conflicts in particular where we think the UN faces a rough ride in the year ahead. Those are the situation in Afghanistan, where the UN has a significant role in the wake of the US pullout, and the situation in Ethiopia, where we see an emerging humanitarian crisis around the Tigray war that is also putting a lot of strain on the UN. And that's why we've asked Laurel and Marithi to join us to discuss these very specific challenges, which will be on the Security Council agenda and the UN agenda, I think in a very prominent way in the coming months. But first, how did Biden do? Gérard, you have watched the US up close in both New York, but also in Washington. You're a longtime observer of Joe Biden. How would you rate his performance on the General Assembly podium just over a week ago?
Well, again, good afternoon, since I am in Paris. Well, compared to his predecessor, really we could consider that it was the most brilliant performance. In a sense, Joe Biden was really reiterating the commitments of, I should say, most of the democratic presidents when they came to the United Nations. Really the will to work through multilateral institutions, the will to solve the problems through cooperation with other countries. And there was, of course, the conflicts and the question of China, when the president said that he doesn't want to open a Cold War with China. So it was, I should say, a good reassuring speech. But at the same time, it was, for me, it was not a surprise, but there was no really dramatic proposal. There was no initiative, major American initiative. There was no hint that the US were going to use the United Nations to solve, the looming crisis in our world. And it's not surprising because the US, in a sense, I try to be short, and as you know, I'm a bit blunt. The US has never been that active through the United Nations. The US has always considered, in a way, that it can act by itself, that it doesn't know the United Nations, or if the US need the United Nations, it will be at the end for stamping, an agreement that has been negotiated by the Americans themselves to give a sort of political legitimacy, or in any case, it will be to oppose the United Nations interfering in conflict that it's critical to the United States. And of course, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a very good example. But in this behavior, I should say, the US are not in any way different from China or from Russia, really. So I should say that Biden, in his speech, has described the US foreign policy, has reassured us about the will of the Americans to work in multilateral bodies, but he has not announced, really a major change in the American foreign policy. The Americans consider that when they are working in a coalition, they have to be the leaders of the coalition. They see policy in terms of leadership. Really, we heard, well, not in the speech, but we heard Joe Biden a few days before saying that Americans had to take the leadership of fighting climate change. Thank you, but really, first the Americans should solve their problem at home. But that's the way the United States are working. So of course, it's a major improvement compared to Trump. But an improvement was not that difficult, but it's a major improvement, this will of really, again, talking through our institutions, through the United Nations. But let's not have too high expectation. It's not a dramatic change. Really, basically, the US is not going to make the United Nations the center of its foreign policy. The United Nations is an instrument of foreign policy for the US, among other instruments. That's the difference between the US and, for instance, UK and France, which, because of their relative power, consider the Security Council as one of the centers of their foreign policy.
Thank you, and thank you for kicking off with a provocative, but I think correct view of how the US sees the UN. Just to say, if we are provoking you, audience members can put questions not in the chat function, but in the Q&A function. If you type your questions into the Q&A, we will have time in the second half of this hour to ask the panel to respond to them. But Gérard, you're seeing this from Paris, you're watching it from France. For a lot of us in New York, we suddenly had to learn rather a lot about submarines last week, because the first days of the General Assembly session were slightly overshadowed by the dispute over the sale of submarines to Australia. There was some speculation last week that a loss of French trust in the US could affect how the two powers work together at the UN. Do you think that's likely, or is this a passing dispute?
No, actually, for me, in a sense, what is more interesting, rather than the usual squabble between Americans and French, really we have had a lot of them. It's only one more, is the fact that we see on one side you have the President Biden saying we don't want to open a Cold War with China, but the other side you see, really this military coalition, which is an anti-Chinese military coalition in the region. So the real question, and it has consequences, of course, on the functioning of the United Nations, and especially Security Council, is whether the US and China will go beyond this, I should say, face à face, this confrontation, to open a political dialogue. Between, frankly, whatever we are going to say about the United Nations is totally worthless if the US and China have only a confrontation, are only in a confrontation mode.
And I mean, Xi Jinping didn't come to the General Assembly, but he sent a pre-recorded speech, as many other leaders did. I mean, he seemed to be wanting to project a certain willingness to cooperate. I mean, do you think that China will continue to look for ways to cooperate with the US at the UN, or are you pessimistic about the way these relations are going?
Well, actually, the China really needs to cooperate with its neighbors and cooperate with the US. China is depending a lot on foreign investment and foreign trade. At the same time, China has behaved in such a way to create worries, concerns among its neighbors in the past months. So the question now, in a sense, I'm publishing a book about Kissinger. I think we need more than ever. We need a Chinese or an American Kissinger, able, really to overcome the squabbles, which are much more important between the US and China than between the US and France, and trying to find a common ground. What are the red lines on each side, and how to define what we called with the Soviet Union, peaceful coexistence. And it's more or less that. For the moment, we are in the stage, maybe I hope it's only a stage, of setting, really the coalition, the military coalitions, which could be seen from Beijing as an encirclement, to be frank. But I trust the Biden administration basically also to open a dialogue with China. We dramatically need it. As I've said, nothing will be possible at the UN without a modus vivendi between the US and China.
Thank you. Kissinger was actually in New York last week. He wasn't at the UN, but I think some lucky foreign ministers got to go and meet him. So we don't know what he was advising them, but perhaps it was precisely that. Laurel, let's turn to you, because one issue that is, I think, high on the agenda for both the US and China, but was also very high on the agenda overall at the General Assembly last week, is Afghanistan. And clearly, diplomats at the UN, like observers everywhere, have been seized of the situation in Afghanistan since the August crisis. Last week in New York, we saw the G20 hold a meeting on Afghanistan. A lot of leaders talked about the need to protect Afghan women's rights in their speeches to the General Assembly. There was even a bit of excitement when the Taliban applied to have a speaking slot in the General Assembly, although that turned out to be a bit of a publicity stunt that went nowhere. So Afghanistan is absolutely, I think, at the top of the UN agenda and will remain there. But that begs a pretty big question, especially in light of Gérard's analysis of how things get done at the UN, which is, what can the UN do for Afghanistan realistically in the coming months and the year ahead?
Thanks, Richard. I think there are some straightforward things that the UN writ large is doing already, and that it's important that it continue doing. So, for instance, the work of the UN humanitarian agencies on the ground in Afghanistan is more important than ever. They've been there. They say they intend to continue to be there. And because there is a growing humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, which predates the Taliban takeover of mid-August, but has certainly worsened since then, that work is essential. The UN has said that in all its multiple guises in which it's in Afghanistan now, it's there, it intends to stay there. They have their offices open. They have, in fact, been returning some staff to Afghanistan who had left initially in mid-August. I think it's also important, and again, this is something that's already on the agenda, for the UN to find ways to keep a spotlight on the human rights situation in Afghanistan, because that will be increasingly difficult for others to do. Already, questions of access to the country and ability to make sense of the anecdotal information that is coming through media and other sources. This is not a new role and even necessarily Taliban specific, though obviously the job has changed now in terms of monitoring the human rights situation and bringing issues to attention. But this is work that the UN had been doing for many years now in Afghanistan, indeed bringing attention to human rights issues that persisted throughout the tenure of the last government there. So that's important with the limitations that there are now on eyes and ears in the country, the withdrawal of many embassies, and the just very dramatic political change, and many Afghans who had been in contact with foreign governments having fled the country. The eyes and ears function that the UN can provide by still being there is very important. I think what's much more difficult now is what is the more political role for the UN. It is possible that a UN envoy or perhaps even the leadership of the UN mission that's still in Afghanistan could play, at least in theory, some role in coordinating the policies and messages of international players, the regional countries, donors, other stakeholders, so that there is, to the extent possible, a single set of messages that is being conveyed to the Taliban about the aspirations and expectations of the international community. But that's going to be very difficult to do, not only for reasons that Gérard already alluded to, of some of the most important governments don't particularly like to be coordinated. They like others to be coordinated, but they don't themselves want to be coordinated. And it's just not clear at the moment what the appetite is among the regional countries that have influence in Afghanistan for having a UN role. I think there are differences among the different countries there, but some of the key players, Russia, Pakistan, others, probably see themselves more as being ones who are suited to a coordinating role rather than the UN. So that's one reason why the political role for the UN, and I'm not speaking of the Security Council per se, but a political role in the region, is difficult. Another that affects, I think, both how this issue might be discussed at the Security Council and also in diplomacy in the region is that we're seeing a growing divergence into two general camps. One are the traditional donors, who at the moment are leaning into conditionality for any kind of assistance to or engagement with a Taliban regime. Again, bearing in mind that in the backdrop here, humanitarian assistance is still flowing to Afghanistan and even being stepped up in this context of a very dire humanitarian situation and risk of economic collapse. But development assistance has been frozen. Aid that goes directly into government coffers has been frozen. Assistance from the World Bank, the IMF, also frozen at the moment. And so there has been, for a past government in Afghanistan until August that was dependent on external donor resources for about 70% of its budget, this is a huge change. So against that backdrop, we have the traditional donors, those who hold the keys to the multilateral assistance, leaning into conditionality, a lot of uncertainty about what Taliban policies are going to be, and a lot of wariness. On the other hand, you have the regional countries, which are leaning into engagement with the Taliban regime, opposing conditionality. And we saw this in particular with China and the Foreign Minister Wang Yi's statement to the G20 last week, when he said there should be no conditionality, that it's the responsibility of those that made the mess in Afghanistan. He was obviously referring to the US predominantly, but perhaps Europe too, to give money to this new regime to clean up the mess, just to prevent economic collapse, and signaling, at least initially, a reluctance of the regional countries to throw, at least China in particular, which would be the main one in question, to throw an economic lifeline to the Taliban. That may change, we'll have to see, but this kind of divergence between the countries that think there should be engagement or looking to find their, no one wants to be the first to officially recognize the regime, but trying to work around that question and lean forward while donors leaning back. And frankly, the traditional donors being constrained not only by their principled stands on what kind of policies they need to see to be able to support a Taliban government and work with the Taliban government, but also constrained by their own domestic politics on this question. And I think those are going to be real constraints on the fundamental issue that the UN already would struggle to resolve, but with this divergence, and a divergence that will be present in the Security Council, be even harder for the UN to take on, of what is going to be the dominant international approach to engagement with the Taliban regime. I guess I'd like to end by just saying, although there is this divergence growing within the international community that I've described, we do have to keep in mind that the real limiting factor here is not the proclivities of donors, it's the Taliban. And what are they doing? I mean, they are, in fact, making it very hard for even those donor countries that would like to find a way for pragmatic engagement to be able to do so because of the constraints of principles and politics. They seem to be, so far, although they want international recognition and international assistance, they are not indicating that they want that at the expense of other priorities that they have. Other priorities being consolidation of their position of control and power in Afghanistan, and maintaining their internal cohesion in order to consolidate their control over the situation. They seem to be, I think, expecting that because international donors don't want to see Afghans starve, that the aid will come to Afghanistan regardless of what kinds of policies and practices they put in place. But I'm concerned that there is still a very wide gap between what is the most progressive, plausible Taliban policies, given what we know about them and how their decisions are trending so far, and on the other hand, what those who hold the financial keys to support to Afghanistan are going to want to see in terms of Taliban policies and practices. And there may just be an irreconcilability there that the Afghan people will suffer from. But it is important to keep a focus on the fact that so far, the limiting factor here is it's not donors' stinginess, it's Taliban policies and practices. And that's where the main pressure, I think, needs to be. I'll pause there.
Thanks, Laurel. Just before I come back to you with a question, someone on the call asked if this conversation is on the record. The answer is yes. The conversation is on the record, and the video will be online. So if you are from the media, please do quote us. We like it when you do. Laura, let me just pick up on your last point about the gap between Taliban behavior and what donors want to see. And let me put a question to you concerning the US, and then actually a version of the same question to Gérard concerning Europe. I mean, Laura, if the Taliban don't start to alter their behavior, do you think that the US will simply lose attention to the Afghan crisis? And do you think it will sort of just walk away from the situation at some point, or would we see other changes of policy?
Well, look, I mean, I think there's reason to think that the US would prefer to focus on Afghanistan as little as possible. And it doesn't require much interpretation and analysis to say that, because President Biden himself has made that very clear in his public statements. In his statements explaining the decision to withdraw American forces from Afghanistan, he said very explicitly that the US has higher priorities. Those higher priorities are competition with China, climate change, cybersecurity, and those are the things that the administration wants to focus on. And it doesn't mean that you always have a choice as a political leader as to what you focus on. I think it's perfectly evident that the administration, the Biden administration, had to focus in the last couple of months much more on Afghanistan than it would have preferred to, because the situation demanded that kind of focus. There's still a lot of political attention here for the time being on the question of some American citizens who still need to get out of Afghanistan, who want to get out of Afghanistan, and others who worked with the US or otherwise seen as vulnerable getting out of Afghanistan. And so I think that will remain an area of focus, but it's undeniable, because the administration has said it, that they want to diminish the attention on Afghanistan. That doesn't mean that they wouldn't want to find that they don't have any perceived interest there still, particularly on the question of whether terrorism threats could grow again, emanating from the region. I think that will be an area of attention. And it doesn't mean that the US will not want to find ways to provide support for the Afghan people. But, I don't think that there is going to be political pressure here. And I think indeed there will be political reluctance to provide financial support that goes through the Taliban government, given the way that their policies and practices are trending, and given the fact that the messiness of the withdrawal cast more of a spotlight on Afghanistan and Washington than might otherwise have been the case, and I think even constrains further the political space for any kind of financial support to the government. So, to be super explicit about it, there is a question now of Afghan state central bank reserves that are held by the US Federal Reserve System, a normal service that is sometimes provided to countries around the world. Over $9 billion in Afghan state assets that have now been frozen, that are directly linked to the banking and liquidity crisis that is already underway in Afghanistan. It is almost unimaginable to me that the Biden administration will unfreeze those assets. Yes, they are Afghan state assets. Yes, you can make a logical argument for why they should be unfrozen. But politically, that would be seen here as, and characterized here in Washington, as giving billions of dollars to the Taliban regime. And it's very difficult to see how that is going to be politically tolerable. So that's a reference point for the other kinds of issues that will come up.
Thank you, Laurel. And Gérard, just to pose the question to you, what do you think Europe's political appetite is to keep engaging financially and diplomatically over Afghanistan? Certainly European leaders in New York last week were very much talking about their desire to stay engaged. But how sustainable do you think that is over time, given all the other challenges that Europe faces?
Well, I think on the European side, it's like in America, there is no appetite, and in a sense, there is no fundamental interest really for the Europeans to remain engaged in Afghanistan. Nevertheless, I think there could be if there is a sort of humanitarian collapse in Afghanistan, which is not excluded, if you have the strength of the images, if you have really people starving, I think that there will be, I'm sure there will be a debate in Europe about humanitarian aid. That's totally sure. For the moment, really considering the reputation of the Taliban and the question of the women's rights and everything we see, about the way the women are treated in Afghanistan, in the education system still recently, I think Europeans will simply prefer to look the other way and not to care about Afghanistan. For Europeans, Afghanistan is the migration, whether we are going to face a major migration of Afghans in a few weeks. But again, if there is a real humanitarian crisis, I think the Europeans, especially the European Union itself, will be obliged to reconsider its stance.
Thank you. Marithi, let's turn to you and turn to Ethiopia. As I said, Afghanistan was a huge focus at the General Assembly last week. There was also discussion of the crisis in Ethiopia that is spiraling out of the conflict over Tigray that began last year, but it wasn't getting as much attention. I mean, actually, on Friday night, I had dinner with some diplomats who specifically said they worried that the focus on Afghanistan had distracted the UN from the situation in Ethiopia, which has been on the Security Council agenda since last October. Because it isn't getting quite so much of a focus, can we start by just asking, what is the situation in Ethiopia now, and why should the UN be giving it more attention than perhaps it has in the last fortnight?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. No, you're right. Of course, as drawn-out conflicts often do, Ethiopia has fallen out of the news quite a bit over the last couple of months. But there's no getting away from the fact that the situation there is grim. This is a war that's been fought at enormous cost. Thousands, possibly tens of thousands dead. And just this week, we heard from the UN aid chief that 5.2 million people in Tigray need emergency assistance, but not only that, but that famine conditions may already be developing there. In the neighboring Amhara and Afar regions, again in northern Ethiopia, we've seen masses and masses of civilians displaced by the fighting over the last couple of weeks, also in need of aid. But what's more ominous, and why I think the UN needs to pay attention, as do other regional actors and the international community writ large, is the fact that we are now coming to the end of the rainy season in Ethiopia, the very long rainy season. But it tends to be in this part of the world that the dry season is the fighting season. It seems that all sides are guarding for more conflict. It seems there's very little appetite for a negotiated settlement. And yet, given already the enormous toll we've seen, given the regional implications, but also given the implications for Ethiopia's future, I think there's no more important case to be made for a resolution than this. It's really urgent that before a huge resurgence in fighting, people really try and fight hard to end the conflict.
And what sort of role do you think that the UN could play in that conflict resolution process? There was a big Security Council meeting on the crisis, I think about 3 weeks ago, but there's still no real sense of how the UN precisely should move forward. So what would we be suggesting to Antonio Guterres if he is one of the 167 people listening into this call?
Yes, I'm sure his ears and eyes are here. But just a couple of things. One, very similar to what Laurel said, getting aid in is absolutely imperative. It's really urgent. The UN has played a leading role in this, but we see only about 10% of the needs having gone, for example, to Tigray. I would say that Antonio Guterres, who has come in for some criticism for not being particularly forward-leaning, but by not taking a very public position, he's had now the advantage of maintaining channels, especially to Addis. I think it needs to convey really that it's intolerable in this day and age to have masses of civilian deaths that are preventable due to hunger. So getting aid in is an absolute imperative. There needs to be more done, less obstruction, and more active efforts to reach the most needy. I think the second thing is attaining a ceasefire. This is no easy task, of course. These are very entrenched divisions. These are actors that are very intent on settling things on the battlefield. I would say that a negotiated ceasefire is quite unlikely at this stage, but at least people can aspire to a humanitarian ceasefire. The case for that is very strong. And if you are to sketch out the conditions under which it would unfold, again, probably not very likely, but maybe this would involve if the Tigray forces could freeze the advances, particularly into the Amhara region, since they pulled out of Afar, but at the same time, maybe reciprocally and just simultaneously, if the authorities could lift the blockade on the Tigray region, allow telecoms, allow the banking services to resume, allow aid deliveries. I think if all parties could agree to something like that, you could conceive of a humanitarian ceasefire in those circumstances. Then, of course, thirdly, you'll be left with very knotty political problems of territorial control, issues of the right balance of power between Addis and the regions, questions of accountability. I think this is where everybody needs to rally behind the initiative by the African Union Special Envoy Olusegun Obasanjo, the former president of Nigeria, recently appointed. I think that's the only game in town in reality. The Ethiopians will not accept any external mediators that are not from the continent or from the region. And we saw an example of this where in 2008, during the bout of violence in Kenya, the African Union appointed former Secretary General Kofi Annan as the mediator. Annan very wisely insisted to avoid forum shopping, that he would be the only mediator. But then you saw a lot of others, the AU, the US, the EU, and others, but particularly the UN coming in to offer technical support. Again, grim prospects, no guarantee it will work, but no harm trying given the grim conditions.
And I think it is true to say that what we're hearing in New York from contacts in the Security Council and the UN Secretariat is precisely that the UN is looking for ways that they could backstop an African Union initiative at this stage, perhaps by offering technical expertise on mediation. The UN, the UN has in other crises, also in Sudan after the fall of President Bashir in 2019, sort of deliberately gone in supporting the AU rather than trying to lead. But actually, this leads to a question about politics in the Security Council over Ethiopia, which has been posed in the Q&A by someone under the pseudonym Techno. And he or she asks, what are China and Russia's position on this? I mean, China and Russia have seemed to oppose significant UN engagement in Tigray since the outbreak of the conflict a year ago. What do you think the reasons are for that?
I would say the reasons are probably not directly related to Ethiopia. Of course, this is a practice the Chinese and the Russians have taken in terms of insisting on the precepts of sovereignty, on backing the authorities in the capitals. I would say, though, that their positions have evolved a bit as conditions on the ground have changed. And in particular, as we saw a deterioration, and then we saw the Tigray forces successfully push the Ethiopian Federal Forces and their allies out of Tigray, you might have seen a softening. I would say that what's absolutely critical is what the position of the so-called A3+1, the African 3 representatives plus 1, what their positions going forward will be. And in this respect, I think the decisions taken in Nairobi will be critical. Kenya will take the rotational chair of the Security Council in October. I think they have shown a greater willingness to try and coax the parties into a negotiated settlement. If the Africans do take a more forward-leaning position, if they insist, as they've done in recent months, that you really need to pursue a negotiated settlement, I think then you're likely to see potentially Moscow and Beijing agreeing to some sort of a concerted effort to look for a negotiated solution. But again, this is not really strictly related to Ethiopia. It's just an extension of the dysfunction of the Security Council that there's been a lot of discussion about.
Thank you, Murithi. And just before we turn to some questions, because we've got some good ones here, Gérard, from your time in the Council, do you have any thoughts about how those countries that are very concerned with the situation in Ethiopia could engineer more UN support in this crisis? I think you're on mute, Gérard.
Of course, I really do agree with what has been said. Knowing the Security Council, the question of sovereignty is totally central to the United Nations, and especially when you consider a country as important as Ethiopia, was really was beloved by Western powers, really. So I think it's not only Russia and China. I think that the other permanent members of the Security Council will be extremely reluctant, really to enter into a fight with the federal authorities of Ethiopia. Really, and I think that everybody will agree, which is a bit a Pontius Pilatus way of saying, well, it's to the African Union to take care of that, really. And so maybe at some point, the Security Council could intervene for humanitarian reasons, but Security Council is not going to do anything against the will of the African Union. That's something that we have learned really in the African conflicts, and which has become a sort of received wisdom of the Security Council. You don't oppose the African Union, you don't interfere with what the African Union is doing. So the Security Council will wait for the African Union to come to New York if the African Union considers it's necessary.
Thank you, Gérard. And so now I will turn to some of the questions that have been coming in through the Q&A. We have questions for everyone, but I'll begin with one that I think largely comes to you, Gérard, and this is from a UN guru himself, Tamrat Samuel, who was a pillar of a lot of UN peacemaking in recent decades. Firstly, Tamrat asks, do you think the conditions we have in the Council now are different to those in the Cold War? Or are we really going back to Cold War conditions? Secondly, given the Council's dysfunction, what should be the role of the Secretary General in sort of independently pushing forward peacemaking and conflict prevention ideas? Is there space for Antonio Guterres, who after all has now secured a second term and has job security for the next 5.5 years, to be a little more in the Dag Hammarskjöld school of Secretary General, out in the world, very proactively promoting peace? What would you say to that?
No, first, I really do agree that the Security Council, the sad really situation of Secretary Council is the reflection of the sad situation of the international relations. And as long as the great powers can't get along, or the great powers are unable to reach compromises, the Security Council is paralyzed. We have not reached the point of the Cold War, because in the Cold War, they were meeting once a month to agree an empty program, really saying, okay, there is nothing that we can do. Let's not really throw the baby with the water of the bath, because the Security Council is doing a lot of things, as you know. Really, there are conflicts, or there are blue helmets, in Africa, in Central African Republic, and in South Sudan and elsewhere. Very often I was used to say the Security Council is taking care of the conflicts which interest nobody but their victims. Really, because the conflicts which interest the great powers are taking care of them and really are refusing the intervention of the United Nations. So that's what we have. But everything, as I've said in the very beginning, really will depend on China, United States. We are entering into a new phase of a global confrontation, which will define the international relations for the coming decades, and on which terms this really confrontation is going to be defined. I really don't know. So that's we are living in a fragmented, violent world, and the Security Council is reflecting this violent, fragmented world. As for the Secretary General, I think, yes, I think that's really, but it's very difficult to do it. The Secretary General needs to be really some courage, really needs to have a clout in the world public opinion. It depends on the personality of the Secretary General. And you're right, Richard, it's the second mandate, so he doesn't need to be re-elected. So that's something that we could consider. You remember that I think Secretary Ban Ki-moon tried on Cyprus, but it didn't go anywhere. But the situation was different. So really, really, it would be great if Secretary Guterres will do its utmost, really to solve conflicts. But he really. You have to say, you have to wish him a lot of good luck, because it won't be easy.
Thank you. And I would refer participants to an article that we put out, I think in May, with a title along the lines of explaining the Secretary General's cautious approach to crisis management, because he does face a lot of pressures against being more bold, even in his second term. Laurel, let me put two questions to you. One is actually really a point of fact from Lenka White, who's a journalist here in New York. She says that you mentioned that China believes there should be no conditionality towards the Taliban. Could you tell us, what some of the other countries that also sort of oppose conditionality are, and why they're making that argument? And then a question from Beth Van Schuck, which is, are there any prospects for accountability in the Afghan situation? Is there any chance of accountability for potential crimes against humanity that may be committed by the Taliban? Is there any way to enforce those norms?
I'll start with the second one because it's the easier one to answer. And my answer is no. I mean, just being realistic, I see no realistic prospects of accountability in any kind of judicial sense, or even in terms of, inquiry sense. And one of the things, I mean, there wasn't during the last 20 years for things that happened before that point and during that point, during that period of time. And so it's not as if the conditions have improved for any kind of, concrete forms of accountability. I mean, I'm not saying this with any relish. I'm just giving my frank observation of the situation. I think one of the things that was certainly the case over the last 20 years and would be now as well, is that a difficulty in the Afghanistan context is that there have been so many atrocities by so many parties that any questions of, quote unquote, even-handedness in how you deal with accountability run into resistance and, insurmountable obstacles from whoever's in power at the moment. So it's the sheer complexity of the situation and number and variety of violators has been one of the, and long time period in question is one of the realities that has, I think, bedeviled any efforts to have accountability in the foreseeable timeframe. On the question of conditionality and who opposes it, we are seeing not only China, but also Russia being quite negative about any kind of conditionality. Pakistan, most obviously. I mean, the governments that have been fairly close to the Taliban, I think the Gulf states too, you would see being quite negative about conditionality on aid. It's not, in other words, it's also not the countries that have been giving large amounts of aid that are the ones who are negative about the conditionality. The one area where there is some commonality of view and of messages being conveyed to the Taliban is the importance of inclusivity in governance. We've seen China, Russia, and others, Pakistan too, stressing that there needs to be some inclusivity of the government of Afghanistan. And I think there's a very practical reason for this. It's not only a matter of principles of inclusivity, but I think that there is awareness that a monopolistic forms of governance in Afghanistan tend to be unstable. So even countries that are not particularly bothered by a Taliban takeover recognize that Taliban rule of Afghanistan is not likely to be stable and endure if they seek to rule monopolistically. I think that same principle could apply to efforts to restrain some of the most egregious potential behavior of the Taliban, of the types that we saw when they were the government in the 1990s. But when it comes to broader sets of principles related to women's rights and women's role in society and educational opportunities, and even some other kinds of human rights concerns, I think we will see less concern expressed on the part of the countries that are opposing conditionality. And certainly when it comes to questions like form of governance and whether there needs to be any, any semblance of democratic choice in what the system of government ends up being, I don't think that we're going to see the countries of the region, Russia, China, Pakistan, and others being too fussy about what the form of government is.
Thanks, Laurel. Murithi, a couple of questions for you. Firstly, Ahmed Balul asks, what's your assessment of the recent Security Council statement on the GERD, the Ethiopian dam, which has been a point of contention with Egypt and Sudan? And I think the Council put out a statement on the need for the countries to negotiate over the dam a couple of weeks ago. Any thoughts on that? And from Hua Jiang, the US has been very vocal in its concerns over the situation in Tigray. How do you think US policy would develop if we do see fighting resume significantly after the rainy season?
Yeah, thanks. I would say on the GERD, this is a case where very similar to what Gérard outlined. It's one where the Security Council really wants nothing to do with it. These are all major countries, Egypt and Ethiopia in particular, with Sudan sandwiched between them. I think at Crisis Group, we've really put out quite a body of work arguing that there's definitely a possibility to settle this through a basin-wide agreement. But then the problem is the low levels of trust between the various actors and the potential political cost in either capital, particularly in Cairo and Addis Ababa. I think in the current environment, the level of relations is really very hostile. At least we did see the Ethiopians do some level of feeling, but without triggering wider political tensions. But I think this is one that will have to be settled domestically, frankly. It's very hard to see the Security Council intervening directly, other through anodyne statements, as we saw recently. I think with the US, if the fighting resumes, we are likely to see a more aggressive US posture. But frankly, US-Ethiopian relations are now at such a low ebb, it's very hard to see that the US can have meaningful leverage. Of Addis Ababa, there might be more sanctions. This is a country that's very dollar deficient, that requires a lot of external support. But the political positions are so entrenched that I think it's wiser to try initially to back the African Union initiative, to lean on as many actors, to lean particularly on Addis, to call off their potential offensive, to see that there can be no military solution to what is a political disagreement. But I struggle to see what direct action the US can take if the fighting resumes beyond taking direct action in terms of individual sanctions and possibly wipe downs.
Thank you, Murithi. And so the final question, and I apologize to those whose questions I haven't had time to pose, but the final question we can pose is to Gérard, and it refers to the Biden administration's emphasis on what some people call micro multilateralism or mini multilateralism. The Biden administration does seem to be working through bodies like the Quad or AUKUS, is that how one says it? The Australian UK triad to contain China. How do you think the Biden administration's reliance on these smaller groupings with a clear focus on China affects debate in the UN and the UN's role in international affairs?
In a sense, what the Biden administration is doing is not new. You remember that I think it was Rumsfeld who was referring to the coalition of the willing. You have always had in Washington the temptation to create a coalition of the people who want, the people which want, and the people which can, and to act under the American leadership. There is nothing really new. It's a deep trend of the U.S. foreign policy. I think, again, we shouldn't have exalted expectations about the role of the UN Security Council. It has always been, in a sense, either there to give a political legitimacy to agreements which were concluded out of the UN, or to take care, as I have said, of the conflicts which are of no interest to the great powers. And we shouldn't be ashamed of that, because these last conflicts have cost the life of millions of people, in DRC, in Central African Republic, in Haiti, in a lot of different places where neither the Americans nor the Chinese nor the Russians wanted to be involved. The UN Security Council is the reflection of the world. So when the world is fragmented, the UN Security Council is weakened, and that's where we are today.
Thank you very much, Gérard. And again, for those who want to dig more into those council dynamics, look for a piece on the Crisis Group website called "Learning to Live with a Limited Security Council," which I wrote on this issue in July, and is really my thoughts about why my job as UN director might be a bit pointless. But nonetheless, Crisis Group continues to employ me, at least for now. We have to go. It's been a great hour. Thank you, Gérard. Thank you, Laurel. Thank you, Murithi. Just before we sign off, Laurel, what should we be looking out for next on Afghanistan from Crisis Group? What's the next product coming up?
Well, on Afghanistan, we have a couple of things we're focusing on now. One are these questions we've been discussing today of how donors and others can engage with Taliban under this new situation or not. What are the limitations there? And we're also looking ahead to what are some of the new threats emerging to stability in Afghanistan and new risks of violence there in the new environment. But also we have some things coming up on US-China, on crisis management crisis management mechanisms for US and China. We have a big series of reports coming out on South China Sea, focusing especially on Vietnam and the Philippines. We're continuing our very close attention to the situation in Myanmar. And Pakistan too is another area we're going to be turning increasing attention to because there's plenty of risk of conflict there, regardless of what happens in Afghanistan. Other things too, but those are some highlights ahead from the Asia program at Crisis Group. And Richard, you were not pointless. You were very pointed.
Oh, thank you. Marithi, what's next from you?
Yeah, I'm afraid we're quite busy as well. We'll be issuing a paper about the deadlock situation in Ethiopia we've just discussed, but also about the looming end of the mandate of AMISOM, the African Union mission in Somalia. Very interesting with the parallels in Afghanistan. But then on Sudan, which is also another very interesting, but unfortunately quite deadlocked transition. We will be issuing a paper, and I'll also urge everyone to subscribe, shameless plug, to our podcast, The Horn. You'll really get everything you need to know about the region there. The next season will resume in the next couple of weeks.
Thank you, Marithi. So lots to read, lots to listen to. And Gérard, you have your book on Kissinger coming out in the next couple of months?
No, on October the 7th in Paris.
Okay. Everyone should be...
It would be a good lesson to refresh your French.
Which we all need. Thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you for everyone who joined this call. And for those recovering from the UN General Assembly, I think that it's time to go and have a rest. But it looks like we at the UN have quite a lot of work to do in the year ahead. So thank you very much indeed. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.